creates questions the human mind cannot answer. Out of reach, past all we can see, hear, and touch, beyond all we understand, lies the extraordinary. The extraordinary is the freak of nature that delivered a message halfway round the world, 50 years after it was written, 50 years after it was cast off a troopship in the middle of nowhere.
And this is why I think it's strange that he should correspond with me by putting a letter into a bottle when there's such a thing as an envelope and a stamp.
It is the night actress Suzanne Summers woke from sleep, and some strange force led her to write her entire life story and change its ending.
I never felt a feeling even during the 5 hours when I was writing. It was almost like automatic writing.
The extraordinary is the chilling, exact detail in this psychic's letter that perfectly profiled Sydney's notorious granny killer weeks before he was brought to justice.
That information certainly did prove to be uncannily accurate, but of course we weren't to know that at the time.
It is the only house that survived a Holocaust. The only house not insured. The only house blessed by a Vietnamese monk.
I stayed up the whole night watching TV. We faded into a picture of Laguna Beach, and it was by helicopter, and suddenly I saw this big white house. And it took me a little while, but I realized it was my house.
The extraordinary is this photograph of 4 generations of one family. A photograph that captures the ghostly image of a long-dead relative from a 5th generation.
We've definitely got great-great-grandma sitting up there watching over us.
Just some of the stories that lie beyond our normal understanding. Tonight on The Extraordinary.
That amazing photograph was discovered by mistake. More on that later. Good evening, I'm Warwick Moss. There is nothing quite as heart-wrenching as seeing a loved one head off to war. Nothing quite prepares a person for seeing someone they care about sail into the distance, not knowing if they will ever see them again. Generations of Australians have felt the pain. Far too many know the feeling of total loss. But sometimes fate steps in to ease that pain, overcoming insurmountable odds to soothe a broken heart. This is one such story. A weather-beaten bottle, washed up on a remote shore. Inside, a crumpled, yellowing letter that told of a simple soldier's yearning to find someone he loved. For more than half a century, the bottle and its precious contents braved the elements, crossed unfriendly oceans, and travelled untold distances, until last year, when it finally reached its destination.
If he had written before then, I didn't get the letters because a lot of mail went astray at that time, and maybe I wasn't meant to get it. It's hard to know. And this is why I think it's strange that he should correspond with me by putting a letter into a bottle when there's such a thing as an envelope and a stamp.
It happened every day in every war. Homesick soldiers writing to those they loved, those they missed dearly. But few of those letters have a history to match one written on board the Empress of Canada on January the 15th, 1940.
To whom it may concern, would anyone finding this letter please see if they can find Miss Nola McKinney, my daughter, aged 11, on the 6th of August.
The writer was Gunner Bill McKenny from RHQ 4th Field Regiment, New Zealand Artillery. Like thousands of others, he was bound for the inhospitable battlefields of the Middle East. Like every one of them, he had no idea what was in store. No idea whether he'd return from the horrors of war. At 41, Gunner McKenny was a veteran who'd bent the rules so that he could join his two younger brothers in the Desert Campaign. 11-year-old Nola was the daughter he hadn't seen for 2 years. The daughter he'd lost when his marriage fell apart back home in New Zealand.
Please let her know that her father is on his way to the war.
Gunner McKenny was obviously desperate, willing to try anything to make contact. We now know when he wrote the letter, January the 15th, 1940. But to this day, no one really knows when or where he hit upon the really novel part of his idea. It was somewhere at sea, somewhere on the Empress of Canada's voyage between New Zealand and Egypt. It seemed like an impossible dream. A father on his way to war, a daughter he loved, a daughter he feared he'd never see again. His message in a bottle, cast into a vast ocean, cast perhaps into oblivion. A hope that lived with Gunner McKenny through those dark days of war. A hope that would not be realised for more than 53 years. In fact, not until a spring day in September last year, a remarkable day for South Australian bushwalker Jim Newland. He was on a 3-day trek through the desolate dune country of Eyre Peninsula when he stumbled on a tiny glinting piece of history.
There's long stretches of beach and to find a bottle on a beach of that size is pretty much like picking a needle up in a haystack, I suppose. You know, it's pretty lucky. I would have put it 30 to 40 metres above the high tide mark. It was behind the first low coastal dune, and it was laying quite clearly above the top of the sand. Probably only the bottom third of the bottle would have been under the sand. The rest was quite clearly exposed. I think probably that it would have lodged on the beach and probably would have been windblown well up onto the beach in strong winds and lodged behind that first coastal dune, and it probably would have laid there for many years. I guess the most significant thing for me was the age of the letter and the fact that it was in such good condition. Realised pretty well straight away that it was a genuine article.
15th of January 1940. To whom it may concern. Would anyone finding this letter please see if they can find Miss Nola?
Tossed around the southern seas for decades, half buried in sand dunes on an isolated South Australian beach, thousands of kilometres from where it was written. After more than 50 years, and who knows what kind of adventures, Gunner McKenny's note had finally been unearthed. Still intact, still legible, but still a long, long way from Nola. Jim Newland did the best he could to preserve the old letter and began wondering how he could trace the writer and his daughter, the girl called Nola, who was 11 years old in 1940.
We sort of surmised that she would have had to have been in her 60s now, and we thought there was a good chance that she would be alive. And then we started to think a bit more about Bill and the possibility of him surviving the war, and we worked out that he'd have to be, originally we thought he'd probably, having an 11-year-old daughter, he'd have to be at least in his, you know, sort of mid-30s or early 30s. And so we figured he might have been in his 80s and could still be alive. So we thought it'd be wonderful to be able to catch up with this guy, and actually to meet the guy that actually wrote the letter would have been extraordinary.
What Jim did was contact his local newspaper, the Adelaide Advertiser, where reporter Chris Hackett entered the investigation.
Obviously the problems involved in tracking down someone who was now at least 50 years older and also had very possibly changed her name, as she had, as it turned out, made it necessary for us to go through the father's side to check down against his war records, which turned out to be the way we did it.
Chris Hackett's search led him to New Zealand, where the Return Services Association delved into their files and located Gunner McKenny's hometown.
They did have some relatives from the hometown, and it was a matter of eliminating them and doing some interviews with those people in an attempt to work out who young Nola might have been and what would have become her in that 50-year period.
A month after the letter was found on an isolated beach in South Australia, 53 years and 9 months after it was written, the contact was made. By now, Nola McKenny was Nola Lyons, a mother and grandmother who was living hundreds and hundreds of kilometres away in Sydney.
I came in at 7 o'clock at night, my phone was ringing. Picked up the phone and I had a very excited cousin from New Zealand. I thought, this is great, they don't spend much money on phoning. And she said, I have the most wonderful news for you. And I was a bit skittish and I said, I bet I won the lottery, and I didn't even buy a ticket. No. And then she started to tell me about this bottle story, and I was so confused. I didn't know what she was talking about.
It was about that bottle, that letter, found by Jim Newland, who also called Nola that night.
I thought, gee, I might be digging up some old wounds here, particularly for Nola and the family. You don't know the circumstances about the separation and all those sorts of things, and I thought, do I really want to dig up this past, and do I, I needed to be fairly careful about how I approached it with Nola.
He was wonderful. He was fantastic. He put me through the 3rd degree to prove who I was. He said, how do you spell your surname? What are your father's initials? So I told him, and then the crowning question, how old are you? So I told him. He said, it's all here, it's you.
With that, the memories came flowing back. The separation, the war, the search for her father, and the reunion in New Zealand when Nola was a young woman of 21.
I knew him. He was right there. And he lifted his hat and he waved and blew me a kiss, and I thought, ha, there he is. Yeah. So we had 12 pretty wonderful weeks together. I got pretty well to know him. You don't really get to know a person in 12 weeks. But we had a good time. I found him a very intelligent man. I did several trips back to New Zealand and met him again and spent more time with him and got to know him some more. He was starting to get a little bit older now, so was I. And we were in touch right up until when he died. So 1966, yes.
In those happy years, Nola managed to build up a picture of her father's life, a life they'd never shared. The war veteran, the champion athlete, the accomplished musician. But not in all their time together after the joyous reunion did Bill McKenny ever mention his letter in a bottle, his plea for help as he set sail for war. News of that came out of the blue 27 years after his death.
The interesting thing was, and this will always stick in my head, it was within days of my father's birthday. He would have been 94 in a few days' time, and I thought, what other trick can he pull out of the bag to celebrate his birthday? It was just so coincidental. I think I could describe it almost as spooky, a little bit spooky.
A father's letter of love delivered across the seas and sands by sheer coincidence. A letter Nola Lyons will preserve and cherish forever.
As soon as I possibly could, I got it down to the State Library, to the Conservation Department, and they are repairing it and will put it into some sort of preservative. And I'll have it forever then, or it will last forever. So I really haven't touched that letter yet. other people have, but I haven't even put my finger on it.
The whole thing's turned out to be really quite a happy story, and that was all I really wanted from the beginning, was to have a happy ending to the whole story, and it's turned out that way.
To whom it may concern, would anyone finding this letter
Please see if they can find Miss Nola McKenny, my daughter, age 11 years, on the 6th of August, and was last known to be in Sydney.
please let her know that her father is on his way to the war with the New Zealand main body of artillery.
The letter took 53 years to get here. It was a little bit late, but I'm glad I waited for it. It was on its way home. It was travelling in the right direction. Well, I'm just so pleased that I've got it. I think in a frivolous moment, I wonder if there's a PS coming.
Links and predictions are often hard to prove. Did the prediction occur before the event, or was it simply deja vu? That scientifically proven split-second disturbance of the mind that makes us think we've been here before. It's hard to define real psychic connections until you run across a case like the infamous granny killer serial murders in Sydney, and uncover an unnerving letter sent to police weeks before John Wayne Glover was arrested. That letter, from someone who had never met the killer, profiled him almost exactly, even down to where he lived. Leafy, tranquil. No one in their wildest dreams would describe this Sydney suburb as sinister. Mossman always seemed like a haven, safe and secure. But in March 1989, that haven was transformed into hell. The sanctuary was shattered by the brutal bashing of an 82-year-old woman. It was the beginning of what became known as the North Shore serial murders, the granny killings. No longer were the streets of Mossman safe. A cold, calculating killer was on the prowl. A killer who preyed on elderly women. A killer who always seemed one step ahead of the police.
Someone who definitely hates elderly ladies. That'd have to be. And unfortunately, I think it is a local person.
Off the cuff, but, as it turned out, an accurate assessment. Almost as accurate as this anonymous letter, which we found buried in a mountain of police files. Point by point, it profiles the killer, his age, his mental state, even his address. But even more startling is the fact that this was written 4 months before the police made their arrest.
This person, I don't know where they got the information from, but they were spot on in a lot of counts.
For 12 traumatic months, Mossman was terrorised. The killer claimed a total of 6 victims, all of them women, all of them elderly. Then in March 1990, the breakthrough. Almost by accident, police arrested and charged this man, John Wayne Glover, a 58-year-old father of 2 who lived in Mossman. To his neighbours, a quiet, friendly and respectable member of the community. Senior Sergeant Dennis O'Toole was a member of the task force that made the arrest.
To get the outcome that we did was enormous relief for the community at large, but as an investigator, it was enormous satisfaction to be involved in something like that and see how a major investigation could be conducted to a successful conclusion.
Even today, John Wayne Glover remains an enigma, but police now know he methodically stalked his potential victims. in the streets of Mossman, in hospitals and nursing homes.
The most chilling aspect of the whole case to me is that he was so ordinary. He was a man who as many people came out after he was caught. They had been in daily contact with this man and thought, here's a happy, avuncular, mature man, the last person that you would expect to be involved in anything like this.
Larry Reiter spent months investigating the crime and the criminal for his book, The Garden of Evil, The Granny Killer's Reign of Terror.
The extraordinary thing about Glover was that for a man who killed so openly, often in broad daylight, or usually in broad daylight, he left very few clues.
So few clues, so many victims, and, miraculously, so many lucky escapes. The killer spent most of his time here, playing poker machines at his local club. One elderly lady, a friend of Glover, even asked him to walk her home from the club because she was too nervous about walking alone with a killer on the loose.
He accompanied her home to her house, and he said, look, let me go in first, give me the key, I'll go in and check that everything's all right. And she said, oh, thank you very much. And he actually walked in the house, looked around, came out 5 minutes later and said, Mrs. X, the coast is clear. Got into his car and went away. Now, how close was she?
All the while, the death toll mounted. The police task force expanded. Eventually, 70 detectives were working on the case, one of the most extensive and comprehensive investigations in New South Wales police history. 10,000 separate pieces of information were logged in the computer. Among them, these 2 handwritten pages from someone who somehow believed they had an insight into the mind of the killer. More than once, there was the warning, he's going to kill again.
Occasionally, a clairvoyant or a psychic would come up with a letter or a phone call that was chillingly close to the truth. In fact, there was one that I remember that was written on December 14, 1989, which was 4 months before the killer was caught. He'd in fact killed 5 times before that letter and had 1 killing yet to go. This person managed to get 10 or 11 major facts about his identity right.
The letter is a little like a jigsaw puzzle. But if you fit some of the pieces together, you come up with a portrait of a serial killer. A killer called John Wayne Glover. He feels so depressed, angry, hurt, confused. He doesn't want to do it, but he has no other release. And then the specifics, the points that still amaze and mystify Larry Reiter.
The fact that he had a hatred of his mother, which was in fact true. He hated both his own mother and his mother-in-law, who bullied him and many people think set him on the path of homicide. The clairvoyant also said that he came from another country. In fact, he came from Britain. They said that he lived near the seaside. He lived at Mossman. The clairvoyant said that he'd struck before in a city far from where he was now. And the truth of that was that he'd hurt a number of people in Melbourne, and police suspect also on the Central Coast. One particular aspect, though, that I found very interesting was that the clairvoyant said that he lived at a house, the number of which is number 81. In fact, he lived at number 18, and it was just a reversal of the numbers.
10 out of 11 points outlined in this amazing letter proved correct. Was it chance, or was it something else? How could a person not connected with John Wayne Glover in any way have profiled him so accurately?
I am aware of the letter, and I am aware of the information in it, and some of that information certainly did prove to be uncannily accurate, but of course we weren't to know that at the time.
Uncanny, but also untraceable. The task force did not simply discard the letter, they did try to analyse the information, but...
The signature was indecipherable, so we don't quite know who actually sent this letter. They never came forward again. not even to gloat after he was caught, to say, look how many I got right.
Remember, that letter was written on December the 14th, 1989, while John Wayne Glover was still at large, still stalking victims. Police were still 4 months away from catching the killer. With 20/20 hindsight, all you can say is, if only. If only.
Some people seem to be born with charmed lives. Some are lucky in love, and others are lucky with money. Good fortune and the reasons for it are as elusive as the reasons for great catastrophe and sudden tragedy. All of us are at the whim of fate, which does with us what it will without notice. This story from Mary Hughes in America will have painful familiarity to many of us who experienced the New Year fires.
On the inside, it is an average California family at mealtime. German-born Doris and Vietnamese-born To Bui sharing 2 family-sized pizzas with their 7 children on a Friday night. Everything seems normal in the Bui house, on the inside. It is only when the camera pulls back, when you start to see the Buis from a distance, do you know that the scene is not so normal. The street they live on is not a normal street. It is called Tahiti Avenue on a bluff called Mystic Hills in Laguna Beach, south of Los Angeles. It is a street of desolation and destruction, so familiar to Sydney's suburbs since the January fires. California had its own Holocaust a few months earlier. More than 500 homes burned down in late October in a firestorm that ravaged the state. To Bui's daughter Angie was at school.
From what I saw from the high school of the fire, it looked really scary. It was big, it was just a big fire line, and it was moving steadily towards us. So as we were evacuating, you just didn't know what was going to happen.
The Bui family fled in the afternoon of October 27th, moments before fire swept through Mystic Hills with a fury that left only this one solitary house standing, the home of To Bui. Doris returned the next day.
All the houses are gone. All the houses are burned down, and across the street, the houses are burned down, and the next street, all the houses are burned down. And yeah, when we came further to our house, and then you see only the White House, a big white house, and nothing is around, only the ashes.
I stayed up the whole night watching TV without seeing anything that resembled my neighborhood. But the next morning, as President Clinton started his speech, they faded into a picture of Laguna Beach. And it was by helicopter, and suddenly I saw this big white house. And it took me a little while, but I realized it was my house.
Its lone survival became the symbol of hope for so many, the one monument of triumph that kept the spirits of exhausted firefighters alive during the endless days and nights of the inferno.
Jeff, the chief, he said when they arrived on the house, he felt like somebody was touching his shoulder and telling him, go and save this house.
But there is something more about the miracle of the Bui house that was not known back then. First, it is the only house in Mystic Hills that was not insured. And the reason it was not insured is this man. He is To Bui's father, a Vietnamese monk.
When he left Vietnam in 1975, he became very serious.
To Bui is a civil engineer who spent 15 years building houses in Germany before he married Doris and came to America. He is also a very spiritual man. He believes in a greater power, though he cannot describe it.
Are you religious?
I think so. I not pray. I cannot pray. But I think I'm spiritual.
Bui's life is dedicated to perfection, to doing perfect work. And when he got his father to ask the spirits if he should build on this Laguna Beach lot, he says he sensed their approval.
He began to pray. Praying is talking to God. He talking to God, and he talking to the spirit from this lot.
He asked the spirit whether this would be a safe place for you to live.
Whatever the spirit accept us to living here.
For 2 years, Bui built the big white house at 1527 Tahiti Avenue with his own hands. And when it was completed, he did not take out the normal insurance. He invited his father over, and the house was blessed. When you meet To Bui and his wife, you realize they are a special family. On the night of the fire, they turned to Buddha.
We gave it from hand to hand, and everybody was rubbing the Buddha's tummy and said, please, let nothing happen. And we hoped and prayed.
While the media made headlines of their survival, Doris, To, and their children did little rejoicing.
Nobody's around, you feel isolated, but the trees are still there, and it's weird looking at these trees and thinking, gosh, people used to live here, and you just walk and you don't see anybody.
Every morning when you wake up and you looked outside the windows and you saw the burned down houses, the ashes, and it was so terrible. It's so amazing. All the houses are burned down and everything is gone, and this white house is there. And you ask the question, why? Why this house survived?
When we feel our life is on course, when we think we are content in our roles at work, at home and in society, we don't expect any sudden awakening in the middle of the night to turn it all upside down. It can happen, even to the most unsuspecting TV celebrity. Just ask Suzanne Summers.
I can't see!
Wait, Chrissy, hang on, watch out.
That scared me. For a minute, my whole life flashed in front of my eyes.
What'd you see?
Nothing, it was too dark.
It isn't the kind of story you'd expect from the lips of the blonde who put the jiggle into the hit TV series Three's Company. It's a far more spiritual experience than you'd expect from her new series, Step by Step.
Oh, no, Frank, you know I have a rule. No entertainment in the bedroom. Other than me.
But this is the unexplainable encounter Suzanne Summers says she had with an inner force that woke her from deep sleep and overtook her early one morning about 6 years ago. An experience that changed her life, led to a best-selling book, and changed her image for every TV viewer in America. Her story is about the unexplained power that led her to write her extraordinary autobiography, Keeping Secrets. A story witnessed firsthand that early morning by her husband, Alan Hamill.
I'm a different person because of this experience. And it's one of these unexplainable things. Alan and I, this was maybe 6 years ago. And Alan and I went to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Santa Fe, New Mexico is the spot in the United States that is like the genesis of what our country is. It's where the Native Americans started their civilization. And they say the ground speaks and the ground is very spiritual, and I really went there because I collect Navajo rugs, and so I didn't go there for any kind of spiritual experience. I went there sort of as a shallow person, actually. And they have these Anasazi ruins. Anasazi is just a word for ancient Indians. I call them condos because they dug their caves on top of one another, and their paths, a series of paths, quite complex actually, just very much like our apartment buildings that are on top of one another. Of course, there are no dishwashers in theirs and wall-to-wall carpet. But anyway, we were the only ones walking around these ruins, and Alan went off someplace, and I found this particular cave that I was just struck by, and the morning sun was coming down on my head, and it was cold, and I just sat on this ledge, and I looked out at this vista that hadn't been touched for 2,000 years, and I sat there all morning. I don't know why. And that night, back in our hotel room, I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I picked up a pad of paper and a pen, and I started writing furiously. I don't do this. I've never done that before. And 5 hours later, when Alan woke up, he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I don't know." And I read it back to him, and I sobbed. I had started to write my life story as a child, which eventually became the book Keeping Secrets, which became the movie Keeping Secrets, which changed the course of my life, because up till then I was a comedian and an entertainer. I sang and danced in Las Vegas and Atlantic City. I still do. And I had written before. I'd written a book of poetry in 1973, but I'd never planned to write this story. I didn't really even consciously remember it. And I never felt a feeling even during the 5 hours when I was writing. It was almost like automatic writing. It was almost like I was a vessel. And because I felt nothing. It wasn't until I read it back that the little girl I was writing about I realized was me. I told a story, and it's almost like I didn't tell it. And now that book became the basis for a life's work that I never planned to do. If you said to me 10 years ago, do you think you'd be in the helping field? I said, no, I'm a singer, I'm a dancer, I'm a comedian. And we've been setting up these family treatment centers for people who live with addicts. The story is about growing up with my alcoholic father, who I loved with all my heart and hated with all my heart. And what it was like from a little girl's point of view, watching what was going on in our house, and the fear. I never understood how much fear I felt living in this environment. It was terrifying. I wondered each night if someone was going to get killed. And it never dawned on me that's not normal to live like that. So is that a premonition? Is that a spiritual experience? I think so. I think something happened to me sitting on that ledge.
When we frame a portrait photograph, we make sure the image we want to capture is center frame, or at least close to it. Backgrounds are important, but not as much as the central figures in the picture. Imagine the shock Teresa Bent got when she decided to frame a priceless family memento, a photograph of 4 generations of her own family, only to reveal the ghostly appearance of a 5th generation. A rare family photograph. 4 generations snapped by a box brownie in October 1953. A family reunion that at the time was unique, that could literally have been historic.
My mum had recently acquired a new camera, and one of the aunts, who was also staying up there, actually she lived with Grandma, I think, at the time, or great-grandma, she was insistent that while we were all together and on holidays up there, because it was such a rare occurrence that we were all together, that she should take a photo. So she used Mum's new camera to take the photo of the 4 generations.
Teresa Bent was the 4th generation in the photograph. She was 10 months old at the time,
And she was the one who many years later would discover an eerie link between that day in 1953 and the past.
I'm sitting on my great-grandmother's knee, and behind her is my mother and my mother's mother.
Almost 40 years went by. Some of the generations passed on. By now, Teresa was married and had a family of her own. But always, in the back of her mind, were her ancestors and the 4 generations photo. It was probably a whim, but one day, about 3 years ago, she decided to frame that photograph and preserve it for the generations to come.
I'd traced the oval shape to cut out for the frame, and as I was cutting it out with the scissors, I swept the corner off the bench, and as I turned it over, I could see a face in the corner. And I thought I'd ruined the photo. I thought I'd cut somebody's face out. Then I turned the photo over. The 4 generations were still there, and I thought, well, who's this?
Who indeed? In the top left-hand corner of the photograph, the corner that Cheryl had cut off, there was a ghostly image. An image that somehow seemed familiar. So familiar that Cheryl went searching through the family archives, back 5 generations to a photograph of her great-great-grandmother, Anne Mayle.
I took them both round to show Mum, and I'd already rung her and told her, you know, what had happened, and took them straight round and showed her, and she was just totally amazed, because she didn't know the great-great-grandmother. None of us knew her. She died before we knew her, but from the photo, she looked and we compared them again, and yep, that was definitely her. So.
And the rest of the family agreed. Great-great-grandma Mayle had unexpectedly entered the picture taken back in 1953.
We'd always referred to it as the 4 generations photo, and now we just refer to it as the 5th generation, because we've definitely got great-great-grandma sitting up there watching over us.
Maybe you need close family ties to see the image, the resemblance, and to believe. Teresa Bent, for one, has no doubts that great-great-grandma Mayle is gone, but she definitely is not going to be forgotten.
Yes, I really do believe that she is watching over us all, being the 1st generation in Australia. She's probably checking up on us all to see how we're going and what's happening. So I believe she's still around somewhere. Could turn up in another photo somewhere.
It was a Christmas present, a tiny diamond ring, a proposal of marriage. But to Joy Ilgut, it was a lot more than a surprise. Only days before, she'd sold the same ring, a family heirloom, to buy Christmas dinner for the man she loved. In a town with hundreds of jewelry shops, her ring had returned. A remarkable coincidence, an untold story. Next week.
That truly remarkable story next week. Now, before we go, a look at another story from next week. It's about a mysterious, unidentified flying object. It has the experts baffled. This UFO was captured on videotape in Australia in 1992. Good night. See you in the future.
We could find no emulsion problems or, problems with the tape. It wasn't a hoax, and the extraordinary thing to this was that it was a daylight sighting. That was the most important thing about this, and it's a genuine sighting. We call it a genuine UFO, an unidentified flying object.